Hello, friends. Welcome back to Cultural Savage. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Melissa Scott-Dixon. She is a licensed professional counselor, writer, and seminary student who's passionate about destigmatizing mental health conversations in faith spaces. She writes and presents regularly on recovery, mindfulness, faith, and feminism. She is currently a candidate for ministry in the United Methodist Church with dreams of creating radically open and inclusive spaces for worship, community, and activism. She lives in Birmingham, Alabama, with her husband and 3 cats. Melissa, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. So, this is the first time we've gotten a chance to talk. If you could, tell us a little bit of your story, where you came from, how you got to where you are. Yeah, just tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Alabama. I'm an 8th generation Alabamian, so
Wow.
the roots run pretty deep here. And I grew up in the Methodist church, but I always say that we grew up kind of casually Methodist, which my Catholic friends have told me is like saying I grew up casually casual. So it was not a super intense religious upbringing, but definitely pretty stereotypically Southern. So I grew up dancing, and because of my experience in the dance world, that kind of planted the seeds for an eating disorder. So big part of my youth and young adulthood was dominated by eating disorder and addiction, struggled with drinking. And so I left the church when I was 18 because a youth pastor told me I was going to hell because I believed in evolution. So,
Wow, okay.
Just your classic story.
Right.
And that started a journey of spiritual seeking that really centered around the yoga community. So both my recovery and my kind of spiritual recovery, I guess I could use the same word for both, really happened within like a yoga and new age context. So I was out of the church for many years and just found myself back in the Methodist church about 3 years ago after a process of recovery and then becoming a therapist myself. So my mental health journey and my spiritual journey have always been kind of intertwined.
That is amazing. Yeah. I can relate. When I was diagnosed bipolar 2 when I was 28, looking back, I could see it would have been a lot sooner, but the spiritual communities I was a part of were just kind of like never talking about stuff like that. So I didn't even think about it. And then as I've grown in my own skin living with this illness, I've also grown kind of back into the spirituality of my youth in some ways. Looks very different in other ways, but yeah, so I totally relate with that. That's awesome. So you mentioned you are now a therapist. What kind of therapy do you practice?
So I'm in private practice. So I have my own practice in Birmingham. So since March, I've been entirely online, which is a whole new world of doing therapy. But so I like to say I work kind of broadly in 4 areas. So eating disorders is a big part of my practice. And then anxiety, trauma of all kinds. And then I do a lot of work with the LGBTQ community as an affirming therapist. And since I started seminary about a year ago, I find that more and more of my clients want to have theological conversations with me.
Yeah.
Often what brings my LGBTQ clients to therapy is the question is like, am I a sin? Like, is my way of being in the world a sin? What's also fascinating is how much overlap there is with eating disorder treatment and theological questions around goodness and authority and right and wrong when it comes to
Yeah.
food and exercise and bodies. So
Because a lot of that eating disorder stuff, from my own experience of talking with friends, and I helped somebody write a book about it, about their experience. It stems from this perfectionism more
mhm,
so than an actual, like, I just need to be thin. It's more of a control issue. It's more of
yeah,
a, like, I need to be perfect. So I never really
yeah.
thought about that in a spiritual context. That's interesting.
It's super interesting. And if you start looking at the research around the roots of eating disorders, like you said, it is very much about control and perfectionism. But there's this real moralizing of food that happens in our
Mm.
society, like
Hmm.
good foods and bad foods, or I've been bad, quote unquote, and so I need to atone for the food that I ate through exercise
Right.
or through dieting. So it's this very, it can have this very legalistic feel.
Oh,
So,
totally. I mean, cheat days, even the language, like
yes,
I'm cheating on what's supposed to be good
right,
because I'm having a burger. Like,
right. Right,
yeah.
exactly. Exactly. And, there's so much, even within religious and spiritual discourse, there's so much language about food as well. I mean, Jesus
Hmm.
says, I am the bread of life. I'm, living water, water into wine, feasting. Like there's all these incredible religious images around food. So
Hmm.
all of that gets really interesting once we dive into it therapeutically. So
Wow.
it's fun work.
So let me ask this: as somebody who has been in recovery from eating disorder, what do you think about the idea of spirituality embodied in food? Like the idea of I mean, you're Methodist, the idea of coming to the table.
Mm-hmm.
Now Methodists practice an open table, is that right?
That's right. Hmm.
Okay, cool. I go to an Episcopal church. We do too. That's one of the things that draws me there. I
Hmm.
love an open table. But at the same time, uh, the image of the table and the image of, like, the feast of the wedding feast of the lamb in Revelation, things like that, they embody food, like you said, with that language.
Hmm.
So what do you think about that as somebody who's been through recovery?
Oh my gosh, I if I ever buckle down and get a PhD, this is going to be my whole dissertation. So I don't know. This may not ever get there, so I'll have to say it here, I guess. Yeah. So food is so basic and fundamental to who we are as people, and
Hmm.
that's a no brainer. Like everybody has to eat to live. Um, so there are multiple ways to view food. Like, is it functional?
Hmm.
Is it purely fuel? Or is it something that's supposed to bring pleasure?
Hmm.
One of the first activities, evolutionarily, that we shared together as groups of people was sharing a meal, gathering around a fire
Right.
and sharing the abundance of the land or the abundance of the hunt.
Hmm.
Um, so, food, the experience of food is very much in our DNA, and we have all these mixed messages about food, like, the feast of the Lord, like the Lord's Supper, but then also fasting is mentioned over and over and over in the Bible as a virtue.
Hmm.
And I find that kind of contradiction in our current Western society. I mean, I live in America. Like,
Right.
we are a country of so much abundance of food, and yet society tells us we should restrict. We should only use food as fuel. We can only eat this many calories. We're not to enjoy our food. So it's this really strangely messed up relationship that we have, and contradictory relationship we have with something that is so intrinsic and so fundamental. And so, the Garden of Eden was like
Right.
full of food, right? Like we're
Right.
supposed to have a relationship with it. And yet we culturally and individually can't ever seem to kind of get it right.
Hmm. That's really interesting. We fast from food, and people might, like, my initial response when you said it's as a virtue, I was like, well, it's a practice, but at the
Mhm.
same time, like, no, you're totally right. As I think about it, it is a virtue because, like, people that fast are viewed as more virtuous. People that live an ascetic life are viewed as like more holy. The whole desert fathers and mothers, like
Mhm.
they went out and lived in caves, and Jesus, like Jesus, and didn't eat for 40 days
Right.
and all of this stuff. And it is seen as virtuous, but then you do also have all these images of the wedding feast of Jesus being called a glutton and a drunkard because he was eating so much,
Mhm.
all of these things.
Mhm.
So
I mean, and if you even like expand the lens out a little bit more beyond Christianity, I mean, the stories of Buddhism, when Buddha reached enlightenment, part of the story is that he had become so ascetic in his discipline that he was down to only eating 1 grain of rice a day, and
oh
that's presented as like part of his enlightenment story. The reality is, the truth is, if people only eat 1 grain of rice a day, like eventually you're going to die. You
yeah,
know,
right.
nothing, there's nothing biologically virtuous about that. And, you know, our bodies need more than that to really thrive and live and to be full of life. Um, so it's fascinating. And then, you know, I was thinking about the feasting thing. You know, in the book of Esther, it opens with the king having this ridiculous like 6-month feast, and he's presented as kind of a
Right,
ghost in the story. So sometimes food is moralized in that way, like, oh, all he did was like eat and drink and have a good time,
right.
and he's an idiot or he's a villain, you know. So where food is moralized all over the place.
Wow, yeah, it really is. um so let's take one step back from just food.
Mhm.
We understand food to be a basic of something that we need.
Mhm.
And we can view it sacramentally and say it's also viewed as something we're supposed to enjoy. But ultimately, at some level, it's a basic need that we have to exist. So, how do you think that our basic needs to exist embody our spirituality?
Um, you know, my that's such an interesting question. My first thought, as you said that, was I kind of went to like a Maslow's hierarchy place in my mind.
Right.
Um, of like, if like if our baseline needs are not met, we can't ever reach the level of spiritual communion, of spiritual experience, of spiritual enlightenment, depending on, you know, what discipline you're coming from.
Hmm.
So that was kind of my first thought, is like, we can't do spirituality if we're not fed. We can't do
Hmm.
spirituality if we're not hydrated. If our bodies are not taken care of. And then my next thought was of God or divine as nurturer, as carer for,
Hmm.
you know, in the way like a mother feeds a baby.
Hmm.
And if you've ever been a parent or um, even just witnessed the act of feeding a child, between, you
Hmm.
know, a parent and a child breastfeeding, that is spiritual. Like, you can't tell me it's not.
Oh, it totally is. When
Yeah.
my oldest was born, my wife had a production problem with milk, so we implemented formula as well. I always will remember the first time that I got to feed my child. Like I was
Mm-hmm.
so it was such just this touching experience. Like I am providing sustenance
Yeah.
to bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh,
Ooh, I
something
just got
that I
chills.
love. Yeah, someone that I love so much.
Yeah.
And you're right. God does play the idea of provider. I mean, even in the Old Testament stories and their concept of blessing,
Mm-hmm.
the blessing was when the wine was rich and when the grain was plentiful, and
Yeah.
that was from God.
Yeah.
So what happens when someone's basic needs aren't met?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think that does to someone, well, mentally and spiritually?
Well, I can tell you what I've experienced and what I've witnessed.
Okay.
So, for me, in my eating disorder, in the, you know, the depths of my eating disorder, a big part of my disorder was a disconnect from my essential goodness, you
Mm.
know. And for me, that is so fundamental to any kind of healthy relationship with spirit or with God or with the divine, is an understanding that I am good enough to show up to this relationship with something
Mm.
that is so big and
Mhm.
so incomprehensible. So, you know, and we haven't talked much yet about diet culture, although we've alluded to it. But what diet culture teaches us is that we are not good enough as we are, and so we have to shape and change and mold our bodies to be good and right and lovable. And often that involves some type of restriction or some type of low level starvation to get our
Right.
bodies to a certain place. So if we're not eating, we're not feeding ourselves, um, for whatever reason, I think there is a risk there of losing connection with our fundamental goodness and with a connection with goodness as a concept. You
Mm.
know, I'm starving myself, so I must be bad.
Yeah. So what does it do to someone when they lose their concept of goodness? When they lose, like, okay, this is something that I struggle with. My therapist and I are talking about it a lot. I actually struggle with seeing myself as worthy, and part of that has to do with my religious upbringing. I was raised pretty like hardcore evangelical, fundamental, charismatic, and the whole like you're a sinner, you're a worm,
Mm-hmm.
internalizing original sin,
Mm-hmm.
like it's done something to me long term.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you think it happens when someone like I can still say at some level that I'm lovable by God, but
Mm-hmm.
what happens when somebody just completely unplugs from their own personal goodness?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in a way, like the words that you just shared started to answer that question of this idea, like I am not. I'm when you said like I'm a worm, it just
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, that hit me like a ton of bricks right now when you just said that. Like if any of us have a concept about ourselves that I am not good enough, I am fundamentally flawed, fatally flawed, that will impact every single move that we make in life. You know, like
Mm-hmm.
it's it impacts how we get up in the morning. It impacts our relationships. It impacts our relationship with substances. You know, maybe we
Mm-hmm.
turn to alcohol or to drugs to numb that feeling of badness. Maybe
Right.
we choose people who choose relationships that are not healthy, stay in work situations that are not life-giving, because we're constantly living into that story of I'm not good enough. So
Mm.
it's almost hard for me to answer that question because I'm like, I think I think it affects everything.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. It does something fundamental to the way that we to our confirmation bias.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that we start looking at in the world is like, see, this is proof that I'm not good enough. This
Mm-hmm.
is proof that I'm bad.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned relationships, and then you mentioned the hierarchy of needs. I think it's on the second tier that it talks about community and relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so you're a therapist, and we've talked briefly via Twitter DM. You're familiar with attachment theory.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone has the, let's just pick the avoidant attachment style
Mm-hmm.
because they don't believe they're good enough, so they pull back from these relationships because I'm not good enough for a relationship. How can spirituality minister to that?
Mm. That's a great question. I want to answer that question by sharing something that happened today, actually, with a client.
Yeah, go for it.
Um, I have a client who a great deal of our work is around the abuse that he suffered family of origin, and um, it impacts every single thing that he does. Every move he makes is just impacted by this idea that he was given, which is that he's bad, he's wrong. And we were talking today about religion and growing up in a very conservative church, a very conservative theology, and the parent that abused him did not attend church with the family typically.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, that parent's religion was disliking me. And
Wow.
yeah, I got chills when my client said that. And I asked him a little later in the session, is your religion disliking you? And that was
okay. That's one of those. Yeah, I just got like the cringies. Like, don't ever ask me that question, anybody ever.
yeah. It felt big to me. Like I had chills as we
That's
were having.
intense.
Yeah. I had never drawn those lines, and so I'm so grateful. My clients teach me as much as, or if not more than I could ever offer to them. But I think that sometimes within attachment, or attachment issues or trauma around attachment, we create a religion or an ideology around a negative sense of self. And so here's the next step in that we got to in this session, which was, if you are indoctrinated into a conservative theology or conservative ideology, especially one that says you have to follow these steps in order to avoid going to hell, it's very frightening to even entertain the possibility of letting go of that ideology or that theology. And so what the dots that we connected were, it might be frightening if you have that wiring, that worldview, to think about letting go of disliking yourself or letting go of hating yourself. Because if we've made a legalistic religion out of self-hate, then attached to that is the idea that I won't get the reward, or I will be punished if I don't adhere to this set of beliefs. So there can actually be fear around letting go of hating ourselves, in the same way that there can be fear around being punished by God.
Now, do you think it's a fear of a paradigm shift or a fear of being proved right?
I think it can be a number of things. My sense is that there may be a fear of rejection, which is an existential punishment. A fear of being cast out from the community, of being alone in the wilderness.
Right.
If I don't adhere to this that I was indoctrinated into.
Right. And that's the whole thing. I'm part of a Facebook group called, it's around the Evolving Faith Conference. And a lot of the language that they use is about, a lot of the language that they use is around the wilderness. And I know when I left church, how hard it was to be by myself. And this was before I had started therapy. So I didn't know why it was hard to be by myself. But it was sitting with that. I can't. Hold on 1 second, please.
Sure.
I apologize. We were having a hard parenting day. One of my children is autistic, and we're working on potty training with him,
Mm.
and it's not going well. So
Oh, I'm so
so
sorry.
mom hit her limit real quick. So I'll edit that big long pause out. Don't worry about that.
Yeah, I totally
Yeah,
understand.
yeah, it's
That's
okay.
hard. My very first job in mental health ever was working with little bitty like preschool kids with autism.
Hmm.
Um, and about 90% of what I did was potty train. So
Yeah,
it
yeah.
was very hard.
He's having one of those days too. So
I'm so
um,
sorry.
it's okay. So, anyways, let me back up.
You're talking about evolving faith and
Yes.
wilderness.
Yeah, so on Facebook, I'm involved with the Evolving Faith community, and the wilderness language that they use. I remember when I left church for a time, I was so isolated.
Mm-hmm.
And this was before I started therapy. And I didn't realize that my isolation was, well, a couple of reasons. One was because I wasn't comfortable with myself, but two, isolation was also because I'd left everything that I'd known behind and it was changing, and that fear of punishment was still there.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do you think that fear of punishment does to relationships? Like, we talk about these avoidant attachment styles, the healthy attachment styles, all of these things, but ultimately they are relationships and they are relational. What is
Mm-hmm.
that fear of punishment when it's ingrained in us that way?
Mm-hmm.
How does that come out in our practice of relationships?
It's so hard to have these conversations as a therapist because, like, the therapist in me wants to ask you that question
Right?
because, like, it sounds like you have experience with that. So, I don't know. Before I talk about it, I'm kind of curious about what your answer to that would be.
Oh gosh. The fear of punishment in my relationships has left me trying to prove how good I am
Mm-hmm.
and that I'm worth the other person not leaving me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I have to, like, it's not that they make a choice to stay. It's the default is they will leave me. So
Mm-hmm.
I have to prove I'm good enough for them to stay.
Yeah. Yeah. I just like my heart just feels so much compassion as you say that, of like abandonment is kind of the ultimate punishment in some relationships.
It is, and with fundamental Christianity, we are told if you're not good enough, God will abandon you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that source of, and then we're also told He's the source of life.
Mm-hmm.
In Him we live and move and have our being.
Mm-hmm.
That He is the nurturer,
Mm-hmm.
but we're cut off from that fundamental nurturing fountain
Mm-hmm.
if we're not good enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, the word forsaken comes to mind as you say that.
Mm,
And biblically, to be forsaken was kind of the ultimate negative.
yeah,
To feel, I mean, Jesus even says it on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?
yeah.
um so part of, I think, God, I mean, you answered that so beautifully, of like part of the anxiety is I will be forsaken.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, the default is I will be abandoned. I am forsaken.
Right.
fundamentally. This is temporary and I have to keep re-earning it, whatever the love relationship is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm kind of thinking as you said that about the power dynamics that are implicit there, because we talked about the word punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to for one entity to punish another, there has to be a power dynamic at work there.
Right.
So the punishing party has more power. So if we're walking around in constant fear of punishment, of abandonment, of being forsaken, we are consistently putting ourselves at a lower power status than anybody else we could be in relationship with, including partners who should be equals.
So let me ask you this then.
Mm-hmm.
How does one achieve a balance of power dynamic when we're also told that we're supposed to be humble?
Yeah, that's tricky.
Just a little bit, just a
Yeah,
little tricky, right?
yeah. Well, I wonder if, to whom are we supposed to be humble? I guess,
Ooh.
is it, because my theology would say, and this is the world according to Melissa, right? This is not, I'm not trying to convert anybody, but my theology would say that humility is required before God,
Right.
and maybe a handful of other situations, but that most other people I could be in relationship with are also children of God, so they are my equals.
Okay. Okay. So let's go back to the open table.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go back to this imagery.
Yeah.
If we're all equals and we're all allowed at the table, what happens when we walk away from the table? I don't mean like a wilderness experience. I mean like we've actually come to the table. We have partaken of the body and blood of Christ, and we walk away from the table. What happens to our attachments with each other
Mm-hmm.
as we move from the table into the world?
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about that theologically and therapeutically.
Go for it.
So, my Wesleyan theology would suggest, and my personal theology would suggest that that the communion experience, like the open table, the Sunday sharing of bread, and in the Methodist Church we use grape juice, but
Mm-hmm.
whatever wine substitute you're using, is supposed to be both transformative and nourishing. So it's there's a deacon who served in my church. When she would present the bread, she would say, "Bread for your journey."
Mm-hmm.
It's not just here. It's not just right now. It's to be taken with you, whether it's in your hand or your stomach or in your spirit, to nourish you so you can go a little bit further.
Mm-hmm.
To share that experience with other people, I think is an equalizing experience, and also a communal experience that reinforces the idea that we have support. We're not alone.
Okay.
That's my take.
Yeah.
Therapeutically, I think communion can be a really fascinating healing experience for someone coming out of eating disorder, because it is the blessing of food. Food is good. You are given food. You need food. You need to share food. You need to enjoy food. Food is a beautiful experience. So I could see that being very healing for our relationship with food if we're struggling with restriction. This is Maggie. She came.
Aww. She's a cutie coming up and saying hi.
Yeah.
So What about those of us that haven't lived with an eating disorder? I don't know. I keep going back to these attachment styles because I think my opinion as a completely non-schooled, just been in therapy a long time person, attachment styles, I believe, are one of the driving forces behind the choices we make,
Mm-hmm.
because we are creatures made for community. So
Mm-hmm.
the way that we relate to the community dictates the kind of choices we make.
Mm-hmm.
And as people change their attachment styles, their choices change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, food for the journey, your journey and my journey. When your journey and my journey are paralleled and are somewhat walked together for a time,
Mm-hmm.
what does that blessing of food do to us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what does the sharing of a meal together do? Um, the first thing that comes to mind for me is, there are a number around the world, a number of pilgrimage walks where
Mm-hmm.
people commit to, you know, 5 weeks or 2 weeks or something to walk this particular path. There's one in Spain that's really well known, and I'm blanking on the name of
Yeah,
it.
I have a buddy that did it, and I don't remember what the name of it is at all. I want to say El Camino, but I know it's not because that's a
I
car.
almost said the same thing, and somebody's listening to this podcast screaming the name of it at their speaker. So
Completely.
I'll look it up after this and be real embarrassed. But so on those journeys, there's a tradition of people in the towns along the path
Mm-hmm.
walking with the people who are on the walk. So you pick up a segment of the walk, and the locals kind of walk with you for a few miles. And sometimes along the walk they'll give you food and snacks, or you can stop for the night and have a meal in a town with a family. Um, and the folks I know who have done these walks, they say it lightens my load to share that moment. Even if it's just somebody who is energized, they haven't been walking for weeks, they're just coming along beside me. They say their energy gives me energy, their strength gives me strength. The food that they offer is more than just food. It's about um, a symbolic representation of the support that pilgrim is being given.
Mm.
So all of that, and when you asked about sharing communion and us sharing it together, I think that there's a lightening of the load that can happen. We're walking together, we're carrying each other's burdens, we're nourishing one another to strengthen. I know that you're on your walk and I'm on my walk, and we're not alone. Even if we diverge, we still have
Mm-hmm.
that connection and that shared experience.
So, how do we embody this outside of the realm of the Eucharist table or the communion table?
Mm-hmm.
How do we embody this idea of lightening the load for each other
Mm-hmm.
as we're walking through our own pilgrimage of life?
Mm-hmm. So this is where I want to talk about diet culture a little bit more, I
Go
think.
for it.
It's going to sound like a rabbit trail, but I think I'm going to bring it back around. So
Even if you don't, it's okay.
we'll see where the road takes us. Um, so diet culture is an oppressive system that we're all indoctrinated into. And it is an ideology that tells us that thinness is superior, thinness is equal to health, that food is moral, and that we have to control our relationship with food to be good enough. Okay. So, and I want to go ahead and say, like, you told me I could cuss. That's a bunch of bullshit, is what that is.
Yeah.
All the lies that diet culture tell us. but we're all indoctrinated into it the same way we're indoctrinated into the patriarchy, so sexism,
Mm-hmm.
racism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So we're indoctrinated into these like really messed up beliefs around food. The extreme of that indoctrination is something like an eating disorder, but everybody lives on a spectrum of diet culture indoctrination.
Hmm.
So we're all trying, like, when you ask, like, what can we do to lighten each other's load? My first thought was like, let's make sure we're like knocking down those walls while we're dismantling other oppressive systems in the world right now. Like, let's add that one to the list.
Right.
So don't don't talk about food as good or bad. Don't say that you were bad for having 2 pieces of cake at your kid's birthday party, because that's going to make the load of diet culture and the load of healing one's relationship with food heavier for anyone else who hears you say that.
Hmm. Just like when there's legislature that rolls back LGBTQ rights, it makes it heavier for those of us that are trying to carry that load.
Yes, exactly. 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 Yeah. Or when, you know, Breonna Taylor's killers are still walking free in the world and, still
Right.
employed, that makes the load heavier for people who suffer under the weight of white supremacy and racism in this country. Like, we have to consistently be doing the work to dismantle the systems
Mm-hmm.
that create that oppression, that create the heaviness in the first place.
Yeah. So it sounds like your idea really of embodying what the communion table is as we walk away from the table is actually embodying justice.
I don't think I've ever put words to it like that, but yeah, I would say amen to that. Yeah, I think so. Because I mean, if we're talking about lightening the load, we got to look at what is the load. The
Yeah.
load is the heaviness of the systems that tell us that we're not good enough, the systems that tell us we're not safe, the systems that create a world that is not safe for certain people.
And without safety, people can't have healthy attachments.
Amen to that too. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
really what we're trying to create in working for justice, stemming from the communion meal, is we are trying to create a place of trust where people can come to learn to have a healthy relationship with one another in a communal way.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And
Wow.
to be nourished and nurtured in the process of that.
Okay, we got to talk about that because I have never once thought of the idea of working for justice as nurturing. Talk to me about that.
So, Dr. King, of course, talked about the beloved community.
Mm-hmm.
And beloved, the word beloved is one who is cherished and nurtured and nourished and cared for and um, given space to be.
Mm-hmm.
Beloved is not someone who's punished. Beloved is not someone uh, who's shoved into a box, right? A beloved is free to be themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So justice work is nurturing and nourishing work at its logical outcome, right? So if
Mm-hmm.
we can successfully dismantle racist systems, sexist systems, homophobic, transphobic, fatphobic systems,
Mm-hmm.
everyone will have, ideally, this is a utopic vision I'm painting, right? Like
Right.
everyone will have room to be themselves and to have access to all the resources that they need. So justice work is the work to create spaces in which everyone can be nurtured and nourished. Don't you think?
I've just never thought about it in those terms. I agree with you. And as you're saying this, what it reminds me of is the passage in Isaiah where it says, the lion will lay down with the lamb, the child will play in the asp's hole, and the children will lead them. And this whole like peaceful vision.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, that's what it reminds me of, because it's just this whole freedom to be what and who you are without the expectation from someone else's baggage. And I've just never thought of justice work that way. I've thought of justice work as toil to tear something down and to build something up, but never in terms of space. Do you think that a spirituality of being human is tied to making space for yourself and others?
My initial instinct is to say I think it's part of it.
Okay. What else is it?
Well, within, I don't know that it's enough just to make space, I guess, is how I would amend that. I think we gotta, because you talked about like the work of like tearing something down and building something back up, and I think that often we don't think far enough down the road with our justice work. So it's not enough to just tear down the systems, right?
Right.
We have to rebuild something. Well, what does that rebuilding look like? Ideally, it looks like, for me, I think it looks like a world in which everyone has space to be, everyone knows that they're safe, and everyone has access to resources. So there's almost this secondary question for me of like, what are we filling that space with?
Oh, that's a good question. That is a really good question.
Because if we fill it back up with the same old crap, then what was the point of all that? If we fill it back up with, okay, everybody, you're on your own. We made the space for you. Good luck. Well, that's not going to work either.
Right.
What are we filling the space with? Does everyone have a loaf of bread and a couple of fish? Like, does everybody have,
right.
If one person's feasting, does everybody have the resources to feast?
That's good. That's a good vision of justice right there. It really is. That actually helps me come to terms with the idea of justice a lot better, because I really struggle with the idea of justice and universal grace. Like, if I believe God is big enough that grace extends to everyone, everywhere, at all times, with no reservation. But what does that mean for justice then?
Yeah.
But you talking about this idea of what are we filling the space with? If grace makes the space and clears out these old systems, then what are we filling the space with is not a question of morality. It's not a question of being good enough, but it's a question of creation.
Yeah.
And being the divine image who is the creator, we take part in that as well. That is brilliant and beautiful. It really is.
I have to pause here and like give full credit to where credit is due. I mean, queer theologians, womanist theologians have been talking about this stuff for decades. So, I kind of connect the dots in my own mind, but for sure. And
if somebody is wondering where to start with womanist theology, I recommend Dr. Will Gaffney.
Love Will Gaffney. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Just start with her and go from there. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, exactly.
So let me ask this final question here for you.
Mm-hmm.
In light of everything we've been talking about, diet culture, attachment theory, justice, all of this, what does this stuff do to shape your vision of the gospel?
Mm. You know, one can read the gospel as a message of abundance. So the Sunday school class that my husband and I have been doing on Zoom in pandemic that we've been attending has been doing this extended study of the gospels. So every week we tackle a different gospel. And it's amazing how many of them kind of end with the punchline, there is enough for everyone. You know, the parables of the workers and the prodigal son. Oh my God, 9 billion sermons have been preached on the prodigal son.
Right.
But you know, the punchline of all of them is there is enough for everyone. And after almost every parable, the audience, the Pharisees, whoever go, what do you mean there's enough for everyone? Like,
what kind of shit is this? This is not fair.
Right. This is not the law. And Jesus is like, tough. There's enough for everyone. So I say that for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think that message is so simple and beautiful and so healing as we, maybe wrestle with issues of justice and issues of, food and diet and feeling good enough and worth. And number two, we have to acknowledge that the idea of there being enough for everybody has pissed people off for millennia. So,
yeah.
If it pisses you off, or if it's hard for you to accept, or if it's, stressful or confusing, like, you're not alone.
Yeah.
But Jesus is going to keep standing there saying, yeah, no, really, there's enough for everybody. No, really, there is.
It just makes you think that justice work also includes working against scarcity culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's enough for everyone. I love that. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Melissa. You have been a great, great conversation.
Oh, this has been so much fun. Thank you.
Good. So we will talk to you. Maybe I'll have you on again sometime if you'd be willing.
I'd love it.
Cool. Hey, thank you. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.